Hello everyone, my name is Costanza and I am about to begin an interview with the author Jennifer Jacquet. Hi Jennifer, thank you for joining me.
Hi Costanza, thank you for having me.
Well, as many of you already know, Jennifer Jacquet is an associate professor in the Department of Environmental Studies and director of XE, Experimental Humanities and Social Engagement at NYU. Her last work, The Playbook, will be the principal topic, of course, of our interview right now. So, Jennifer, can you please tell us what is The Playbook about?
The Playbook is for anyone who is interested in denying science to further their bottom line and make more money because science somehow poses a threat to their operations. So it outlines a sort of four-pronged strategy. You can challenge the problem that science has identified. You can challenge the causation, where the science may have identified a cause of that problem. You can challenge the scientists, journalists, and activists who are promoting doing the science. And you can challenge the policy.
Of course, thank you very much. So, do you think the playbook is a book for everyone? To what kind of audience you would suggest to read it?
Well, I hope it is obvious to those listening that and especially given my affiliations, that the playbook is not meant to be actually a genuine product for CEOs. It's meant to be a product for the public, for civil society, for those who want to understand how the private sector has worked to challenge the system of knowledge, the scientific method, basically. And we hear a lot of positive stories all the time about how industry and private companies support science, because they do. We just lived through that with the COVID vaccines, Moderna, Pfizer. It rolls off our tongue, these companies, right, who helped really unlock the power of science to create something that protected all of us. But we hear far less about how those companies, some of them the same, many of them different, are engaged in a fight against science when science threatens their business operation. So we see that the private sector is very pro-science when they can use it to make money. But when science threatens to undermine profit, science becomes the enemy, and the corporations have a playbook that they use to attack science.
Okay, so, what about the title, The Playbook? I understood that, of course, it's a reference to the subtle games that the advertising managers and the heads of the companies play in the public relations field. And of course, I suppose that it is a light way to address a very important matter like this.
So the playbook, I chose the title The Playbook because it's very predictable. It is a manual. This is a strategy that has been used, tailored a little bit to each industry, but and to the present moment, to the current technologies that are available, but has been sort of honed and globalized through particularly public relations, as you noted, for the last 125 years. And so the playbook really shows you, and I hope the content of the book, which shows how the playbook is used across so many different industries, starting with radium, lead, asbestos companies in the early 20th century, moving into tobacco and agrochemicals and other kinds of chemical companies, vinyl chloride, and then into a space like the fossil fuel corporations, and now meat and dairy companies regularly using the playbook to challenge science as well. And so showing how common these strategies are across so many different industries, I think really does show that it is a playbook. It's not one company's approach. It's not one industry's approach. It is the playbook for the private sector.
Of course. So let's talk a bit about the style that you used in the playbook. I won't lie, at some point I found it a bit difficult to understand where the joke ended. I was like, is she serious right now? I mean, what I'm trying to say is that it really seemed to me like you were suggesting what the CEOs of the future will have to be capable of doing in order to let their company succeed. Aren't you afraid that this ironic style won't be understood by your audience or, by the media, especially by the media?
Well, I'm not too afraid, because I believe so sincerely that the playbook already exists, that whatever, you or I may know about it, the playbook itself is actually even more extensive than we realize. And the PR firms really do have these strategies down pat. So this book is an attempt to pull back that curtain a bit. And I felt that doing that required an approach that wasn't entirely sincere, in part because if I embodied, as I do, my alter ego who wrote the book, a corporate consultant who could really think, what does the corporation need in this moment? It made the problem and the tactics more obvious to me. And it helped me think through, of course, in Brazil, they don't have a huge climate denial base the way that we have here in America, because they don't have gigantic fossil fuel companies that are running their political show. But you know what they have? They have meat companies who challenge the link between meat production and deforestation and climate change, because that sector is so large in their country. And so as soon as you realize that sort of scientific knowledge, of course, is geopolitical, but so is its denial, you can predict where it will occur and why.
Of course. So in America, the playbook was released in July this year, right? 2022. I was wondering if there was some kind of, I don't want to use the word, consequence, but I think that it's the most correct one. So were there some kind of consequences after you released it?
Well, of course. I mean, there are consequences to everything, but I'll say that it was also released in the UK at the same time. And in England, at least, they seem to appreciate the satire of the book much more than the American audience.
Oh, really?
I think that there's a section, a large portion of American readers seem to be very sincere. And so this didn't necessarily sort of land with them in the same way. And also, the business literature in the US, it's also sort of meant to be a spoof on all of this CEO kind of grandiosity that we're steeped in American culture. And I think it's very hard to kind of get out of that as an American and to sort of and to appreciate the irony. So I think that as for actual consequences, let's say like threats of litigation, the UK team, my publishers there, had a marvelous team of lawyers who went through the book multiple times. And so we are really, we feel very confident in the content as well as the way things are said, that there won't be, knock on wood, any serious legal consequences from the book, which has happened for other people who write in this space, of course. My strategy was sort of to take away that component of risk by not talking specifically about Monsanto over and over again or ExxonMobil over and over again, but to draw this thread between so many companies and so many industries that it really wasn't about one single company and its approach, but again, about this kind of very general, very broad strategy. So I hope that the consequences will be that people begin to recognize these patterns and are able to sort of build up defenses against them.
Of course. So your legals actually got your back, right? They were there for you.
Somebody's back. I think they have the publisher's back, and on account of that, my back, yes. It is possible to find some case studies in the playbook, and personally, I found the one about the addiction to social media and the problem of obesity very interesting, because of course they are very hot topics.
So I was wondering, was that for you too? I mean, why did you choose these two topics in the first place?
Yeah, so the case studies are, they are foreshadowing the chapter to come. And so I'm outlining very much in the spirit of business case studies. So if you go to school in America, you do an MBA, you're steeped again in this culture of business case studies. Here's an industry or a company that's facing some kind of problem. What should they do? These kind of open-ended questions. And a lot of the book rested on historical examples that were very well documented for the reasons we just discussed, because the lawyers want hard facts. The case studies opened up an opportunity for me to say something that was more vague, right? Like about social media addiction, plant the seed. You know, you've been hearing about this, but then you're hearing from companies like Facebook or Twitter that this is actually just personality, you know, which is exactly what the gambling industry said about addiction. It's exactly what the alcohol industry says about addiction. So that you have, I could play with a current topic where there wasn't as much research, but I could speculate, right? Or kind of give this glimpse of, hey, look, they're kind of looking at alternative causes for this problem. They're not arguing that social media addiction doesn't exist, but they're looking for somebody to blame other than the producer of the content.
It was like, it's your fault, it's not the industry's fault. It's
of
your
course.
Personality, it's not, industry's fault. Okay, I get it. So another question, the playbook seems, of course, like we said before, at first glance, a manual, like you said earlier, or a guide for whoever wants to, be in control of a company one day, know the rules of the game, etc. So what is the purpose of the playbook? I mean, you said earlier that your target was the civils, okay? So what do you suggest we do? What do we have to do to be more aware? And once we know the rules that you provided us, how can we use them?
So I consider the playbook a little bit like, in high school, at least I learned about logical fallacies, the kind of straw man or ad hominem attacks, these ways of identifying debate tactics in your opponent that you could point out a flaw in the logic to get to the heart of the argument. And I sort of view the playbook as something similar. It's a guide actually to these kind of strategies so that we can identify them as civil society, as citizens, and identify, of course the industry is making this argument that we should postpone regulatory action or policy on controlling methane until the science is more certain. That's something they always say. Okay, that's straight out of the playbook. In fact, let's leapfrog over that argument and not take 10 more years to study the problem and put in some good policy to control methane emissions. And I felt like it was in that spirit, a kind of tool to see the kind of flaws in the other side's arguments or the commonalities across them, so that we could make good science-based decisions and policy decisions more quickly. And we don't get sort of distracted. That's, the playbook is designed to delay action, to postpone regulations so that the companies can continue to make money. So we see this with fossil fuels because the science became clear that climate change was happening. This is clear, you could argue mid-century, but certainly by the 1980s. And the companies made a decision that we will not be in business. Therefore, we will deny the problem entirely. We will say climate change itself doesn't exist. The tobacco companies, they didn't do that. They didn't say cancer doesn't exist. They just said smoking doesn't cause cancer, but there is such a thing as cancer. The fossil fuel companies took a whole other approach, which is to deny the problem entirely, because this would allow them to gain even more time. And indeed it did. We have now 60 years of no regulatory action because we had to spend an additional 20 or 30 years just convincing people that climate change indeed was real. And in that time, the problem got worse. So I think there's a spirit of of hastening action that's in the playbook, to not be slowed down by these arguments, to keep our momentum and to put policies in place to protect ourselves and the earth.
Thank you. So last question, it's not the playbook related, it's about a current topic. You know, of course, that the New Zealand has banned the purchase of cigarettes to whoever is born, you know, from after 2009 onwards. So what do you think about that? Because a lot of people, especially on social media, where everybody has an opinion, as you may know, they think that it will lead to a big mess of contraband. What do you think about this New Zealand purpose to be the first smoking-free country in the world?
I think it's marvelous. I mean, New Zealand's doing so many interesting things, and they had a great COVID response too, as you know. So there's a lot of leadership there that is really looking, I think, at science and trusting the independent research that's done and making very good decisions. And I think what you see as, regardless of whether or not you see this decision as the most effective, you know, form of regulation of smoking or not, the tobacco companies do not have a stranglehold on the government. This is a good thing. For a long time, we could do nothing about smoking at all because there was so much power that the tobacco industry had within the halls of government and certainly within controlling public discourse. And this says that has been broken down to some extent in one admittedly pretty small country. But I think it's very promising. I mean, let's not forget, though, that many of these tobacco companies have diversified into other products that are, you know, vaping and other tobacco products that aren't smoking. So, so they're, you know, it's kind of, a lot of people see smoking as already having taken a big sort of a blow with the master settlement agreement in the US, which sort of, you know, it did a lot of different things for tobacco companies and made the anti-smoking advertising so much bigger on packages and things like that. But the reality is that many of these companies are still very powerful and very, very active. So I think for me, it's heartening to see that decision in New Zealand. And I wouldn't at all be surprised if the companies are now gearing up with a playbook to attack this kind of legislation that they might expect to see copycatted elsewhere. So I would expect right now that they're developing a strong counter strategy, and that, you know, if Indonesia or China tried to introduce something similar, the tobacco companies are ready with a kind of with an arsenal, as I call it in the playbook, yes, to fight back against this kind of policy.
Okay, so Jennifer, thank you so much. It was such a pleasure to meet you. And that's all for today. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.